Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Finnish Lessons 3.0, 3rd edition. What Can the World Learn from Educational Change in Finland? By Pasi Sahlberg. Foreword by Howard Gardner. Afterword by Sir Ken Robinson. Narrated by Phil Thron. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Foreword. I begin with a provocative statement. Whether held in your hands or displayed on your screen, the book that you are perusing is well on the way to becoming a classic. Indeed, to coin a phrase, an instant and evolving classic. Let me unpack these terms. One should not invoke the word classic lightly. A classic is a work that captures and sustains attention, that changes our understanding of an important topic or concept or facet or view of life, and, most important but most difficult to anticipate, a work that continues to remain alive and vital, as it were, evergreen despite the passage of time. Although it's far too early to declare with certainty that Finnish Lessons is an educational classic, there is a good chance that it will achieve that exalted status, hence the descriptor, instant. Already there are encouraging signs. Following its initial publication in 2011, there have already been 2 additional editions, each considerably revised. Then there are the enthusiastic readers across the globe. The book is a bestseller with nearly 30 translations. Moreover, as happens with many bestsellers, the book is much cited and quoted even by individuals who have never laid their eyes on it. My guess is that you are listening to this edition because you have heard it is a book that you should hear. Indeed, that you need to hear, even if you have heard an earlier edition. And what of the descriptor evolving? Often, when authors issue a subsequent edition of a work, they simply add some recent references, say a few words about the pleasure that they feel about the work's success, and touch on a few points that they might now express differently. But Finnish Lessons 3.0, 3rd edition, is far from a simple repackaging of the first and second editions. Rather, author Pasi Sahlberg digs deeper into the past of Finnish education, sketches the circumstances that gave rise in the latter half of the 20th century to its exceptional K-12 education system, details what has happened in Finland and other corners of the educational world in the past decade, and lays out a spectrum of possibilities, ranging from optimism to disappointment, with respect to the future course of education in the country of his birth. Here are some of the reasons for my high opinion of Finnish Lessons. In every society, educators have searched for the best way to educate their children. This has been true since the time of Rousseau's Emile, indeed, since the time of Plato's Republic and the Analects of Confucius. There are always competing views, though they often cover only part of the spectrum. Plato versus Aristotle, Rousseau versus Mill, Confucius versus Mencius. And all too often, these idealized prescriptions come from individuals who may have thought deeply about the topic, but who have not themselves tried to put their ideas into practice. We live at a time when competition among nations is fierce, and when each nation seeks the magic bullet that will propel it to the top of the global rankings, PISA, TIMSS, and foster children who will go on to become masters of the universe. And especially in the so-called developed countries, members of OECD, for example, there has been a virtual consensus: have clear, uniform standards, follow them assiduously, test students frequently, and award the students, teachers, and locations where the scores are high, while penalizing or castigating, or even attempting to hide, those where the performances are mediocre or worse. There are nuances, of course, but this perspective has been the default position, whether one is in Singapore, South Korea, or the United States. In Finnish Lessons, Pasi Sahlberg, the scion of a long line of Finnish educators and himself a classroom teacher, researcher, and policymaker both nationally and internationally, has challenged this consensus. Drawing on the Finland experience, he has provided an alternative model. In a phrase that still brings smiles to my face, he characterizes the global consensus as GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement. And, as captured in the table, pages 186 to 187 in the typed version, he critiques and contrasts this one-size-fits-all perspective with the lessons that have been learned in recent decades by educators in his native country. In this book, you will hear how a country that, 50 years ago, was barely on the radar screen of international comparisons rose to the very top. And far more importantly, Pasi Sahlberg explains in beautiful and memorable detail how Finland followed its own path. If I can riff on the words from the famous American ballad, how Finnish educators did it their way. Let me mention just some of the striking contrasts with the germ approach. In Finland, the following are true. Teaching is a highly valued profession. Individuals vie to become teachers and are compensated like other professionals. Teachers remain in the classroom. They don't immediately vie for higher administrative positions and higher pay. Teachers don't fear research. They don't disdain it, and they don't claim that they can't understand it. Instead, they receive training in research, keep up with findings in the literature, think of themselves as researchers, and actually carry out useful research. Play is actively encouraged. It's not discouraged or even banned. School hours are limited, as is homework. Ethics or morals are not ignored or ceded to religious authorities. One's personal standards of conduct matter, and they are modeled with conviction. Student health and well-being are a proper concern of educators. Professional discourse goes beyond buzzwords. Teachers don't just talk about emotional intelligence or peer learning or individualized instruction. They study it, put it into practice, reflect on the difference it makes, and, as good researchers, make adjustments when the prescription does not do what it is supposed to do. Sahlberg believes ardently in these touchstones of an effective educational system. But in Finnish Lessons 3.0, he explains that they cannot be taken for granted or assumed. No more in education than in other sectors of society does time stand still. In just a decade following the original publication of Finnish Lessons, the performance of the Finnish educational system has, at best, remained stagnant and, according to several indices, has declined significantly. This disappointing situation may have come about because of fame or smugness or, alternatively, because lessons learned from Finland have now been absorbed and applied skillfully by other competitive societies. Sahlberg provides another explanation. Rather than learning from its own experiences in decades past, Finland has not revisited or recreated the distinctive blend, the cycle of experimentation and reflection, which in a few decades transported it from an educational backwater to a nation in a leadership position in the world of K-12 education. We might say it is no longer functioning as a learning system. Pasi Sahlberg sets a very high bar for future works of synthesis in education. We live at a time when large data sets can be readily assembled and analyzed. Scores of educational think tanks all over the world measure every conceivable variable, from test scores to class sizes to the variations in performances across classes, schools, cities, provinces, nations, and demographic groups. Accordingly, when a scholarly work is revised or a new text is issued, it is possible not just to speculate on how and why things might differ, but rather to delineate what's actually happened through charts, graphs, statistical tests, and other hard data, and then to reflect on the factors that may have brought about reported changes. As a seasoned researcher and analyst of data, Pasi Sahlberg handles these forms of information deftly, and reflective listeners can join the author in trying to make sense of what happens from one year to another, from one country to another, from one variable to another. Finnish Lessons is a work by a polymath, teacher, researcher, data analyst, speaker, blogger, writer, loving family member, and cherished friend. The list of accolades could go on. But what most impresses me is that Pasi Sahlberg articulates and embodies deep values about equity, fairness, personal growth, community bonding, societal flourishing, and global harmony, as well as the importance of helping every young person find an area of passion and then enabling its nurturance. These values come through in this volume, and they are perhaps the chief reason that this book is destined to become a classic. Howard Gardner, Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education, Harvard Graduate School of Education, September 2020. Preface. Just about 10 years ago today, I was writing a preface to the first edition of Finnish Lessons. After working 5 years in Washington, D.C., followed by another 3 in Torino, Italy, I had returned back to Finland with the manuscript to take a new job at the Ministry of Education and Culture in Helsinki. Since I left Finland in 2002, much had happened there. Finnish schools had become admired by many and envied by some. Finnish students had done very well in international student assessments compared to all other countries. The country's economy had become a poster child among politicians and business leaders after being ranked as one of the world's most competitive economies several years in a row. In global media, Finland was praised as happy and healthy, but also a cultural lone wolf that finds its own way to do things rather than follow others. In August 2010, Newsweek magazine front page read, "The best country in the world is," and the main story in that issue revealed the rest: Finland. I had a manuscript that I thought I'd never write. Education in Finland was simply too personal for me. I was born into a family of teachers, raised in a teacher's apartment in a small village schoolhouse, served as a teacher and teacher-educator for many years, and spent a good part of my professional life in national education policy work that made Finnish education very familiar to me, so much so that it was often difficult to explain it to those unaware of my country's culture, traditions, history, and values that define much of what schools do. Many of my colleagues in the United States urged me to write a book about Finnish education. Andy Hargreaves, who was a professor at Boston College, was researching international education reforms and insisted I tell the story about the Finnish way. Linda Darling-Hammond's research on the teaching profession and teacher education included Finland, and she encouraged me as a former teacher and teacher-educator to write a book that would explain the roles that great teachers play in building a successful education system. Stephen Heinemann, who had served 20 years at the World Bank and then became a professor of education policy at Vanderbilt University, convinced me that Finnish education deserved to be shared with scholars and policymakers in the United States and in the rest of the world. No more was needed to convince me to give this book a try in North American markets. Without these friends and some others, this book probably wouldn't be here. Finnish Lessons was launched in Alberta, Canada, in November 2011. Honorable Dave Hancock, who was Minister of Education at that time, had invited me to talk about my new book to 500 Albertan school leaders. Under his leadership, Alberta was a world-leading education system, neck and neck with Finland in global charts. My book was soon widely acknowledged in Canadian media and became a bestseller there. After Fareed Zakaria featured Finnish Lessons on CNN,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?